As I said, Joe, when you called me, I am incredibly honored by this responsibility, and I'm ready to get to work. I am ready to get to work.
Let's do the laudatory profiling for one. She's the first Black woman, she's the first Asian American, the first South Asian descent woman. She's a daughter of immigrants. She was an alumna of a university that was historically Black. There's so many firsts in that. So clearly a moment of celebration for all of us.
The difference between a white male vice president and a female Black and South Asian vice president. She's also descended from immigrants. So you have that whole third world, global South representation angle in there, which will be interesting to see how it pans out.
But I think what it does for our discipline as in international relations is highlight two things. One, race, and second, multiculturalism, and how we need to have both those conversations even more in our classrooms as we look at somebody who's now become the Vice President of USA. The second thing that came to my mind while I was reflecting on her big victory was just the past itself. And I think sometimes we get so lost in celebratory moments that we do not look at the history. 1870 was the 15th Amendment, which was passed, and it gave African American men the right to vote. 1920 was the 19th Amendment when women got the right to vote. It was not until 1965, which was the Voting Rights Act passed, there were a lot of voting suppression till then. Right? So it took us 150 years, right, to elect a Kamala Harris to office and recognize Black people and the power of representation. So I think what I want to reflect on also is politics, gender and representation, and what does it mean to have a woman of color or a person of color in a position of power.
States represents quite a milestone and quite a shift. For IR, it raises two fundamental questions. One is, of course, the role of personalities in IR in determining policy, determining what states do. Classical neorealists would tell you that all leaders are basically the same rational actors driven by the same motives, etc. But that's clearly not true. I mean, leaders bring a whole set of beliefs, preferences. What they see depends on what they are ready to see. And what they choose to do also varies. So I think this is an interesting case for IR scholars, maybe after 8 years or whenever. The other issue that it raises, of course, is of the role of identity in politics, in IR, in international relations, but in how states behave. And there, I think the scholar might go one way in looking at it. Me, I'm a practitioner, I was. And as a practitioner, for me, frankly, identity is very important. And we see this across the world today. In IR, you see the rise of nationalism as a reaction to globalization, to the threats that people perceive to their identity in a globalized world. And that has become a more and more important factor. But in this particular case, I think what is interesting to me is the identity that Kamala Harris herself has chosen as a Black, as an Indian American, as a woman, things that she has stressed in the way she presents herself. And that represents quite a shift. And this was brought home to me when a European friend of mine told me the other day that, do you realize that this is the first time that one of the most powerful leaders in the United States has absolutely no link in terms of identity, ancestry, or even in terms of the common intellectual heritage leading back to the Enlightenment, which that leader chooses to stress, with Europe. That this is the first time that you have a purely American leader being elected in the US. And that's a big shift because Europe is used to thinking of the US as a European extension. So there is, I think, this does represent a fundamental and a very important shift. Now, how it plays out, what it does, I don't know.
The third thing that came to my mind was to not think of women as monoliths. If a Kamala Harris is in power, we also had more than 70 million people vote for Trump, despite and in spite of his misogyny and sexism. So I think it's also interesting to kind of reflect on the other side of the story and see what does politics constitute of. And the fourth and the last thing that I wanted people to reflect on was just think about grassroots political activism. It was women protesters and marches all throughout 2017 and 18 that actually flipped the House of Representatives from red to blue. And I think that's also something that we need to keep into consideration, that rather than just focusing on these women at top, I think we need to start thinking about grassroots kind of struggles for racial, reproductive freedom and justice movements. And what does a woman in a position of power mean for those struggles and movements, right? So 3 big takeaways. Think about representation, think about intersectionality, and keep your curiosity always, always alive.
The first is this idea of restoration that is deeply pervasive in both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's foreign policies. Both Harris and Biden have voiced their opposition to Trump's withdrawal from international alliances and treaties such as the Paris Agreement on climate change. They've stated that they would like to reverse these actions and restore some of America's pre-Trump foreign policies by immediately ratifying these international treaties.
In India, of course, people like to stress her Indian American roots and so on. But I think that for a practitioner, that doesn't make much sense. She's an American leader, elected by the Americans, and she thinks of herself as American, and that's what she is going to be. If we start making claims on her because she has some Indian ancestry, it, I think, would be counterproductive. She would have to prove that she's objective and that actually she's not swayed by such considerations. So,
on the US-India relationship, I think there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States on the relationship and the role India plays in the world today. So whether it's advocating for a rules-based international order, especially in the Indo-Pacific, or whether it's the role India is supposed to play in South Asia as a balancer against China. So I think there'll be that element of continuity from a Trump administration. The change, I think, will be in the Biden-Harris administration's emphasis on democratic values, on human rights. I think they'll emphasize that. And if not emphasize, it'll definitely assume more significance under a democratic administration. Whereas under Trump, Modi just basically got a free pass on that.
The second thing that I, for one, would particularly look out for would be how Kamala Harris balances the pertinent but somewhat potentially conflicting tenets of a foreign policy. For instance, on the one hand, she has stated that she will stand up to countries like China, Russia, or even Venezuela when it comes to matters of human rights and the rule of law. And that seems somewhat fitting given her record as a former senator. But at the same time, she's also stated that she seeks to cooperate with countries like China on global challenges such as climate change. So while these seem to be good and pertinent aspects of a foreign policy, calling out countries on matters as perceptively sensitive as human rights, while also expecting to diplomatically and multilaterally cooperate with them, might seem easier on paper than it does in practice. So I, for one, am particularly looking forward to seeing how someone as promising as Kamala Harris would juggle with and balance these very interesting and important concepts.
Now, coming to Kamala Harris specifically, it depends on on actors and how much agency you give them to affect change in a system. Sure, actors can have agency, but she's not a Nehru, So how much of a difference will Harris being there make for the US-India relationship? I think the difference, if any, will show in the optics, the messaging, the feel-good stuff, the whole India connect. But I don't think it's likely to transform into concrete, significant differences in US foreign policy towards India. For Biden-Harris administration, at a more regional level, I think a democratic administration will perhaps channel the US bureaucratic and diplomatic foreign policy machinery more effectively to undertake more comprehensive engagement with South Asia. And I also expect them to be a bit smarter on China with some smarter methods of engagement rather than the unpredictability that was so characteristic with Trump administration. Lastly, at a global level, you have significant US retrenchment and retreat. So, a Democratic Biden Harris administration will have to make significant efforts to reverse that if they even want to fully, that is. America is still very much America first. So, I wouldn't exactly call them a silver bullet for increasing US engagement, but there's definitely likely to be elements.
See how this plays out. India's ties with the US and the transformation of India-US relations since 1998 have not been because of China. They have been because of our converging interests in the Indo-Pacific, but also the significance and the importance of the US to India's own transformation into a modern, prosperous, strong society. And because of a common interest in the democratic experiment that we are both undertaking. I mean, the US was the first actually to attempt multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy, which was not based on a common ethnicity or language or religion. India is trying a similar experiment in very different circumstances. So I'm not sure that the China factor, I'm not sure what China policy we will see. I don't think it will deviate too fundamentally because there is bipartisan consensus in the US on a much stronger policy towards China. But I do think that the Biden administration will probably also look for ways of working with China on some issues like climate change and so on. I don't see that affecting India-US relations directly, except that, of course, our relations with China are in crisis right now, and that is something that we will have to deal with.
And I really hope there's a time in the near future when it's as normal and you guys don't have to get bites from all of us asking if a woman's been elected in a position of power or a woman is running for office. It should be as boring and as normal as any other man running for office.